What happens when the thing you were born to do is taken from you? What happens when the gift that defined you, that made you who you are, that drew thousands of people into the presence of God, simply disappears? What if the voice that filled stadiums was silenced, and in that silence you heard something you had never heard before? This is the story of Bethany Grace, the worship leader who lost her voice, and what she found in the silence will change the way you think about worship forever. Because the miracle in this story is not that she got her voice back. The miracle is what she discovered when it was gone. Bethany Grace was 29 years old, and she was, by almost every measurable standard, the most successful worship leader of her generation. Her debut album, Throne Room, had been nominated for a Grammy in the Best Contemporary Christian Music category. Her second album, Unveiled, had gone platinum. Her songs were sung in churches across 47 states and 31 countries. On any given Sunday morning, an estimated 12 million people worldwide were singing words that Bethany Grace had written in her living room with a guitar on her lap and a cup of cold coffee on the end table. She had 4.2 million followers on Instagram. Her YouTube channel had over 800 million cumulative views. And every Sunday she stood on the stage of Harvest Life Church in Nashville, Tennessee, one of the largest megachurches in America, and led 50,000 people in worship across 3 services. The voice. Everything always came back to the voice. Bethany Grace had a voice that did things to people. Not just musically, though the musical quality was undeniable. A rich, crystalline soprano with a range that spanned 4 octaves and a warmth that made every note feel like a personal conversation between the listener and God. But it was more than technique, more than talent. When Bethany Grace opened her mouth and sang, something happened in the atmosphere that no sound engineer could explain, and no music critic could adequately describe. People wept. People fell to their knees. People who had walked into the auditorium angry at God walked out reconciled. People who had been carrying burdens for decades set them down in the middle of the second verse and felt lighter than they had in years. The worship team called it the anointing. The sound engineers called it the Bethany effect. The congregation called it the angel voice. And Bethany herself, in her more honest moments, called it the only thing about her that mattered. That last part was the problem, but she did not know it yet. To the world, Bethany Grace was the picture of a woman walking in her calling. She was young, beautiful, talented, and successful. She had married David, her college sweetheart, a quiet, steady man who worked as a music producer and who loved Bethany not for her voice, but for the woman behind it, a distinction that would become critically important later. They lived in a beautiful home in Brentwood, a suburb of Nashville, where the houses were large and the lawns were green and the neighbors were other worship leaders and Christian artists and the occasional country music star. They drove nice cars. They wore nice clothes. They attended the right events and knew the right people and posted the right photos and lived the kind of life that young worship leaders across the country looked at and aspired to. But behind the Instagram photos and the Grammy nominations and the 50,000-person Sunday mornings, something was wrong. Something had been wrong for a long time. And the wrongness was so subtle, so deeply woven into the fabric of Bethany's success, that she could not see it any more than a fish can see the water it swims in. Bethany Grace had confused her gift with her God. She had confused what she did with who she was. She had confused the stage with the sanctuary, the performance with the prayer, the applause of 50,000 with the approval of one. She had become, without realizing it, a woman who worshiped worship, who found her identity not in the God she sang about, but in the singing itself, who measured her closeness to God not by the quality of her relationship with Him, but by the quality of her vocal performance on any given Sunday. A good performance meant God was near. A mediocre performance meant God was distant. And a great performance, the kind that brought 20,000 people to their feet with tears streaming down their faces, meant God was not just near, but pleased. And Bethany was not just talented, but worthy. This is a subtle and dangerous idolatry because it looks exactly like devotion. From the outside, Bethany appeared to be the most devout woman in any room. She prayed before every service. She fasted before recording sessions. She studied scripture for songwriting material. She raised her hands and closed her eyes and poured herself out on that stage with an intensity that left her physically drained and emotionally spent. But the devotion was pointed in the wrong direction. She was devoted to the experience of worship, not to the God of worship. She was in love with the feeling of His presence rather than in love with Him. And the difference between those two things is the difference between a marriage and an affair. David saw. He saw it the way a quiet man sees things, not dramatically, not confrontationally, but with a steady, accumulating awareness that something in his wife's soul was out of alignment. He would watch her come home from a Sunday service, vibrating with the high of performance, talking a mile a minute about the moments when the crowd surged and the lights hit just right, and the bridge of the song lifted like a wave. And then he would watch her crash on Monday, flat and irritable and distant, as if the absence of the stage had created a vacuum that sucked the life out of her. He tried to talk to her about it, gently, the way David did everything. Beth, when was the last time you just sat with God? Not sang, not wrote, just sat? She would look at him with genuine confusion. I sit with God every day, David. On stage. That's where I meet Him. David would nod, and he would go to the bedroom and kneel beside the bed and pray for his wife, the same prayer he had been praying for 3 years. Lord, show her before it's too late. Show her what she can't see. It was a dangerous prayer. The same kind of dangerous prayer that every spouse in this series has prayed. The whatever it takes prayer. The prayer that invites God to intervene with the full force of His love, which sometimes feels, in the moment of intervention, indistinguishable from cruelty. David did not know what the answer would look like. He did not know that it would come on Christmas Eve, in front of 20,000 people, in the form of a silence, so sudden and so complete that it would sound like the end of the world. He did not know that his wife would have to lose the thing she loved most before she could find the one she loved least. He only knew that something had to change, and that God, who is faithful even when we are not, would find a way to change it. The pain started in September, 3 months before Christmas Eve, 3 months before the silence. A small, persistent ache at the base of Bethany's throat that appeared after the third Sunday service and lingered through Monday and into Tuesday, before fading just in time for Wednesday night rehearsal. Bethany noticed it the way a marathon runner notices a sore knee, with annoyance, not alarm. She was a professional vocalist. Throat discomfort was an occupational hazard, as common as calloused fingertips for a guitarist or aching feet for a dancer. She drank hot water with honey and lemon. She gargled with salt water. She hummed her vocal warm-ups in the shower and told herself it was nothing. But the pain did not go away. It came back the following week, arriving earlier and lasting longer. By October, it was present every day, a dull heat that sat behind her larynx like a coal that would not cool. Her range began to shrink, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone in the congregation would notice. But Bethany noticed. The high C that she used to hit with effortless clarity now required a push, a forced expulsion of air that left her throat raw and her eyes watering. The sustained notes in the bridge of Unveiled, the song that had become her signature, the song that brought 50,000 people to their feet every Sunday, were becoming harder to hold. She was compensating, dropping the key a half step here, shortening a held note there, adjusting her technique in ways that were invisible to the audience, but felt to Bethany like cracks in a foundation. David noticed before she told him. He was a music producer. He had spent 15 years listening to voices with the precision of a jeweler examining diamonds. He heard the strain in her upper register during a Wednesday rehearsal and said quietly, after the band had left, "Beth, your voice sounds tired. When was the last time you saw Dr. Park?" Dr. James Park was an otolaryngologist, an ear, nose, and throat specialist at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. He was also the unofficial physician to Nashville's music industry, the man whose waiting room on any given Tuesday might contain a country music legend, a pop star, and a Broadway actress, all of them there for the same reason. Their voice was their livelihood, and Dr. Park was the best in the business at keeping voices alive. Bethany had seen him for routine checkups twice a year since she started performing professionally. She was overdue for an appointment. She had been overdue for 3 months. She had not gone because she was afraid of what he would find, and she was afraid of what he would tell her to do about it. She went in November. Dr. Park performed a laryngoscopy, threading a thin, flexible camera through her nasal passage and down to her vocal cords. He studied the images on the monitor with the focused, impassive expression of a man who has seen 10,000 pairs of vocal cords and knows exactly what healthy ones look like. These were not healthy, Bethany, he said, and she could tell by the way he said her name that the news was not good. You have bilateral vocal cord nodules. They're small right now, but they're there, and they're going to get worse if you keep performing at your current level. He turned the monitor so she could see. The nodules looked like tiny bumps on the smooth, white surface of her vocal cords, one on each side, positioned at exactly the point where the cords came together during phonation. They were caused by overuse, by years of 3 services every Sunday, plus rehearsals, plus recording sessions, plus conference appearances, plus the 100 other demands on a voice that had never been given adequate rest. I need you to stop singing for at least 6 weeks, Dr. Park said. Complete vocal rest. No singing. Minimal talking. Whisper only when necessary. The nodules may resolve on their own with rest. If they don't, we'll need to discuss surgery. 6 weeks. Bethany stared at the monitor. 6 weeks of silence meant missing 6 Sundays. 6 Sundays meant 6 services without her leading worship. 6 services meant 30,000 people who expected to hear her voice and would hear someone else's instead. It meant canceling 3 concert appearances, a recording session, and the keynote worship set at the National Worship Leaders Conference in January. Dr. Park, you don't understand. Christmas is coming. It's our biggest season. The Christmas Eve service alone has 20,000 people. I can't. Bethany, Dr. Park's voice was firm in the way that only a doctor who has delivered this speech 1,000 times can be firm. If you continue to sing on these nodules, you risk permanent damage. I'm not talking about a few weeks off. I'm talking about potential loss of your upper register permanently. The choice is rest now or rest everything later. She sat in her car in the Vanderbilt parking garage for 30 minutes after the appointment. She did not call David. She did not call her pastor. She did not call her manager. She sat in the gray November light filtering through the concrete ceiling and stared at her hands on the steering wheel and had a conversation with God that was really a conversation with herself, because the two had become indistinguishable. Lord, you gave me this voice. You called me to this ministry. People are depending on me. The Christmas Eve service is the biggest outreach event of the year. Thousands of unchurched people come specifically to hear the music. If I'm not there, if my voice isn't there. She trailed off. The unspoken end of the sentence hung in the air like smoke. Then those people won't meet God. That was the lie she was living inside. The lie so deeply embedded in her identity that she could not see it as a lie. The belief that she was necessary, that her voice was the bridge between God and his people. That without Bethany Grace on that stage, the connection would be lost, the worship would be diminished, the anointing would be absent. It was the lie of every gifted person who has mistaken the instrument for the musician, the paintbrush for the artist, the pen for the author. And it was about to be exposed in the most devastating way possible. Bethany drove home and told David about the appointment. She told him the diagnosis. She told him the recommendation. And then she told him her decision. I'm going to push through. Just through Christmas. Dr. Park is being cautious. I'll rest in January. I'll take the whole month off. But I cannot miss Christmas Eve. I cannot let those people down. David sat across from her at the kitchen table and looked at her with an expression she had seen before, but had never fully understood. It was the expression of a man watching someone he loves walk toward a cliff. Not in anger, not in frustration, in helpless, heartbroken love. Beth, he said carefully, what if the person you can't let down is yourself? She bristled. What does that mean? It means I'm not sure this is about the congregation anymore. I'm not sure it's been about the congregation for a long time. I think it's about you, about what happens to you when you're not on that stage, about who you are when you're not singing. The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples outward that Bethany would not fully feel until much later. In the moment, she deflected them the way she deflected all of David's gentle, accurate observations, with a spiritual-sounding counter-argument. David, God called me to worship. This is my assignment. I'm not going to let a minor health issue stop me from doing what God has called me to do. David nodded. He did not argue. He went to the bedroom and knelt beside the bed and prayed the prayer again, the dangerous prayer. And this time he added 3 words that would echo in his mind for the next 12 months. Whatever it takes, Lord. Whatever it takes. Christmas Eve at Harvest Life Church was the Super Bowl of worship. The production team spent 3 weeks preparing. The stage was transformed into a winter wonderland of white, birch trees and twinkling lights and artificial snow that fell from hidden machines in the ceiling rafters. The sound system, already one of the best in the country, was augmented with additional speakers to handle the overflow crowd. Camera crews set up for the live stream that would reach over 500,000 households. And backstage, in a dressing room that smelled like flowers and hairspray, and the particular electricity of a performance about to begin, Bethany Grace was doing the one thing she had been told not to do. She was warming up her voice. She had not rested it. Not for 6 weeks. Not for 6 days. In the 7 weeks since Dr. Park's appointment, she had performed every Sunday, attended every rehearsal, recorded 2 songs for the Christmas album, and spoken at a women's conference in Dallas. Her throat had progressed from aching to burning to a constant grinding pain that she managed with a rotating cocktail of throat sprays, anti-inflammatory medications, herbal teas, and prayer. A combination that she had begun to think of as faith when it was actually denial. She hummed her scales. C, D, E, F, G. The lower notes came out clear enough. The middle range was tight, requiring more air than usual, but functional. She pushed toward the upper register. A flat, B flat, B. The notes thinned. The sound that came out was not the clear, ringing crystal that had earned her the nickname Angel Voice. It was a strained, breathy approximation, like a photograph taken through dirty glass. She stopped. She took a drink of warm water. She breathed. She told herself it would be fine. The adrenaline of the stage would carry her. It always did. The anointing would carry her. God would carry her. She had stood on stages when she was sick, when she was exhausted, when she was emotionally shattered, and the voice had always been there, because the voice was not hers. It was God's. She was just the instrument. But tonight, the instrument was broken. And instruments do not have the luxury of adrenaline. The service began at 7 o'clock. 20,000 people filling the auditorium in a wave of winter coats and excited children, and the particular energy of Christmas Eve. That combination of nostalgia and hope and expectation that makes even the most hardened skeptic open to something larger than themselves. The worship band took the stage. The lights dimmed. A single spotlight found Bethany as she walked to center stage, microphone in hand, wearing a white dress that caught the light and seemed to glow. The first 3 songs were in her comfortable range. She had chosen them deliberately, working with the music director, to build the set list around keys and ranges that would minimize the strain on her damaged voice. And for those first 3 songs, the mask held. The voice was not perfect. David could hear it from his seat in the front row. Could hear the places where she was pulling back and pushing through and compensating. But the congregation could not. They were lost in the worship. Hands raised, eyes closed. 20,000 people singing along with the angel voice on Christmas Eve. Then came the moment that Bethany had been building toward all night. The moment that the production team had designed the entire service around. The band fell silent. The lights dropped to a single warm golden spotlight. The artificial snow began to fall. And Bethany Grace, alone on the stage, began to sing, "O Holy Night." The first verse was quiet, intimate, almost conversational. "O holy night, the stars are brightly shining." Her voice was low and warm, and the words floated out over the audience like a lullaby. The crowd was mesmerized. 20,000 people, barely breathing. She moved into the second verse, and the arrangement began to build. Piano, string, a gentle swell of percussion. The melody climbed, note by note, toward the climax that everyone was waiting for. The moment. The famous, towering, spine-tingling moment that every version of "O Holy Night" is building toward. "Fall on your knees." Bethany reached for the note. It was a high B flat, a note she had hit 10,000 times in her life. A note that lived in the center of her upper register like a friend she had known since childhood. She opened her mouth. She pushed the air from her diaphragm. She sent the signal from her brain to her vocal cords, the same signal she had sent 10,000 times before, and nothing came out. Not a cracked note, not a strained whisper, not a pitchy approximation, nothing. Silence. Complete, absolute, devastating silence. As if someone had pressed a mute button on her throat. The sound cut out mid-phrase, mid-breath, mid-note, with a suddenness that was almost violent. One moment she was singing, and the next moment she was opening and closing her mouth like a fish pulled from water, producing no sound at all. The pianist kept playing for 2 bars before he realized what had happened. Then he stopped. The strings stopped. The drummer stopped. The entire 20,000-person auditorium went from the swelling crescendo of "O Holy Night" to absolute silence in the space of 3 seconds. Bethany stood on the stage in the golden spotlight with the artificial snow falling around her, and 20,000 pairs of eyes staring at her, and the microphone in her hand, picking up nothing but the faint, desperate rasp of air passing through a throat that had finally, completely, irreversibly given out. She tried again. She pushed harder. She forced air through vocal cords that had swollen shut, that were hemorrhaging from the nodules that had been torn open by 7 weeks of abuse. And the sound that came out was not singing. It was not even speaking. It was a noise. A small, terrible animal noise that the microphone amplified across the silent auditorium, and that would haunt Bethany in her nightmares for months to come. The microphone slipped from her hand. It hit the stage with a thud and a squeal of feedback that cut through the silence like a scream. Bethany pressed both hands against her throat, her face contorted in a mask of pain and horror, and the particular agony of a nightmare that you cannot wake up from because you are already awake. She looked out at the sea of faces, 20,000 of them, all watching her, all waiting, all confused. And then she turned and walked off the stage. Not ran, walked, because running would have been too honest. Running would have been an admission that something catastrophic had happened. And even in this moment, even with her voice gone and her throat on fire and her world collapsing around her, Bethany Grace was still performing, still maintaining control, still trying to manage the optics of her own destruction. The worship pastor took the stage and led the congregation through the rest of the service. Bethany did not hear any of it. She was in a backstage bathroom, sitting on the floor with her back against the wall and her hands still pressed against her throat. And she was trying to scream, and no sound was coming out. David found her there 15 minutes later. He sat down on the cold tile beside her and put his arm around her and held her while she sobbed without sound, her body convulsing with tears that her voice could not accompany. The emergency room doctor at Vanderbilt confirmed what Dr. Park would confirm in detail 2 days later. The vocal cord nodules had hemorrhaged. Both cords were severely inflamed and swollen. Surgery was now unavoidable. Recovery time, minimum 6 months. And even after surgery, even with perfect recovery, there was no guarantee that her voice would return to its former quality. No guarantee that she would ever sing professionally again. David drove her home in silence. Not the silence of anger or disappointment. The silence of a man who had prayed whatever it takes and was now watching the cost of that prayer unfold. He reached across the center console and took her hand. She held it so tightly that her nails left marks on his skin, and she stared out the window at the passing lights of Nashville on Christmas Eve and felt, for the first time in her life, what it meant to be completely, utterly, helplessly silent. The days after Christmas Eve blurred together into a gray, shapeless mass of sleep and silence and shame. Bethany did not leave the house. She did not answer her phone. She did not check her email or her social media, though David, who was monitoring both, told her that thousands of messages had poured in, a mixture of concern, prayer, and the inevitable speculation that thrives in the vacuum of information. Some said she had a nervous breakdown. Some said she had a secret illness. Some said she had been living in sin and God had judged her. The internet, that merciless amphitheater of opinion, had turned the worst moment of her life into content. Her collapse was trending. She communicated with David through a small whiteboard and a dry erase marker. The doctor had ordered strict vocal rest. No speaking, no whispering, no humming, no clearing her throat. Nothing that would cause her vocal cords to vibrate. For a woman who had spent her entire adult life producing sound, the restriction was not just medical. It was existential. She was being asked to exist without the thing that made her exist. The whiteboard became her voice, and its limitations became a mirror for her loss. She could not express nuance. She could not convey tone. She could not laugh or sigh or make the 100 small vocalizations that humans use to connect with each other. She would write, "I'm fine," on the board, and David would look at her face and know that she was not fine. And the gap between the written words and the unspoken truth felt like an ocean. The surgery was scheduled for the second week of January. Dr. Park would perform the procedure, removing the nodules with a precision laser and repairing the hemorrhaged tissue. The operation itself was relatively straightforward. The recovery was the unknown. 6 months of vocal therapy, gradual reintroduction of sound, a slow, careful rebuilding of the instrument that had been pushed past its limits by a woman who valued the gift more than the body that housed it. But the physical recovery was not the darkest part of Bethany's winter. The darkest part was what happened inside her when the voice was gone and there was nothing left to fill the silence. In the first week, she grieved. She sat in her home music studio, surrounded by the artifacts of her career. The gold records on the wall, the Grammy nomination certificate, the guitars that David had given her on various anniversaries, the framed set lists from her biggest concerts. And she grieved the way a person grieves a death, because something had died. The identity she had built over a decade of ministry, the persona of Bethany Grace, the worship leader, the angel voice, the woman who stood between God and his people and sang the connection into existence, that person was dead. killed by 2 tiny nodules on 2 thin strips of tissue in her throat. In the second week, the grief turned to anger. She was angry at Dr. Park for being right, angry at David for being right, angry at herself for being stupid. And beneath all of that, fueling it like an underground fire, she was angry at God, because this was supposed to be His ministry, His calling, His voice flowing through her throat to His people. If He had wanted her to stop, why didn't He just tell her? Why didn't He send a clearer message? Why did He have to humiliate her in front of 20,000 people on Christmas Eve? She sat in the living room in the dark and wrote on her whiteboard in letters so large and so angry that the marker squeaked against the surface. Why? But God did not answer. Not yet. The silence that had taken her voice had also, it seemed, taken God. The presence she used to feel on stage, the warmth and electricity and overwhelming sense of nearness that came when she sang, was gone completely. She tried to pray, but prayer without voice felt like breathing without air. She tried to worship, but worship without song felt like swimming without water. Every pathway she had ever used to reach God, singing, speaking, performing, leading, was blocked, sealed, silent. In the third week, the anger cooled into something worse, despair. Bethany sat in the living room on a Tuesday afternoon and turned on the television. The Harvest Life Church service was streaming live, as it did every Sunday. On the screen, a young woman named Lauren was leading worship. She was good. She was more than good. She was talented and passionate, and the congregation was engaged, and the music was beautiful. And Bethany, watching from her couch wrapped in a blanket with her whiteboard on her lap and no voice in her throat, realized something that cut deeper than any medical diagnosis. They had replaced her. Of course they had. The church had 50,000 members. It could not simply stop having worship because one worship leader was out. Lauren had stepped in and stepped up, and the church had kept going. And God had kept showing up, and people had kept worshiping, and the world had kept turning without the angel voice of Bethany Grace. She was replaceable. The woman who had believed on some deep, unexamined level that she was essential to God's work on earth was watching the evidence to the contrary play out on a 65-inch screen in her living room. God did not need her voice. The church did not need her voice. The worship continued. The presence fell. The people wept and raised their hands and met God in the music. And Bethany Grace was not there. And it did not matter. The realization was a demolition, not of a wall or a roof, but of the entire building. Everything she had constructed her identity upon, her talent, her uniqueness, her indispensability, was rubble. And sitting in the rubble, alone and silent and small, was a woman who had to confront the most terrifying question she had ever faced. If God doesn't need my voice, then who am I? She wrote it on the whiteboard. The words stared back at her, stark black on white. God, if my voice is gone, who am I? She stared at the question for a long time. She stared at it until the afternoon light shifted, and the room grew dim, and the television went to sleep. And the only illumination was the fading glow from the window, and in the silence, which was no longer just the absence of her voice, but the absence of everything she had ever used to avoid this moment, Bethany Grace began, for the first time in her adult life, to wonder if she had ever truly worshiped God at all, or if she had only ever worshiped the feeling of worshiping God. The rush, the high, the dopamine cascade of standing in a spotlight before 50,000 people and feeling the music surge through her body like electricity. Had that been worship? Or had it been performance dressed in worship's clothes? The question terrified her more than the nodules, more than the surgery, more than the possibility of never singing again. Because if the answer was performance, then 10 years of ministry had been a lie. And the woman sitting on this couch, silent and stripped and empty, was not a worship leader who had lost her voice. She was an actress who had lost her stage. The Bible had been on the nightstand the entire time. Not Bethany's performing Bible, the leather-bound, ribbon-marked, underlined in 4 colors study Bible that she carried to church and to conferences and that she opened during songwriting sessions to mine for lyrics. Her other Bible, the one David had given her on their wedding day. A simple, unadorned, New International Version with their names and wedding date engraved on the cover. She had not opened it in over a year. It had been sitting on the nightstand under a stack of magazines and a phone charger, accumulating the particular dust that settles on objects that have been forgotten. She found it on a Saturday morning in February, 6 weeks after Christmas Eve, 2 weeks after her surgery. She was looking for her phone charger, moving the stack of magazines, when the Bible slid off the nightstand and fell open on the floor. It landed face up, its pages splayed. And Bethany, who had no particular belief in the supernatural significance of randomly opened Bibles, found herself looking down at the words on the page nonetheless. Psalm 46:10. Be still and know that I am God. She stared at the verse. It was a verse she knew. Of course she knew it. She had sung it 100 times. She had set it to music, a driving, anthemic worship song, with a soaring chorus and a key change in the bridge that never failed to bring the audience to its feet. She had performed Be Still at conferences and concerts and Sunday services, belting the words into microphones with a power and intensity that made the rafters shake. Be still. She had never once been still while singing it. She picked up the Bible and sat on the edge of the bed and read the verse again. Then she read the verses around it. God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam and the mountains quake with their surging. She read slowly, not because the words were difficult, but because she was, for the first time, actually reading them, not scanning for song lyrics, not mining for metaphors, not looking for the hook that would become the chorus of her next hit. Reading, the way a starving person eats, with desperation and gratitude and the full attention of every faculty. Be still and know that I am God. Be still. The command was so simple, it was almost insulting. Be still. She had not been still in 10 years. She had been singing, performing, traveling, recording, posting, appearing, speaking, leading, always out front, always the voice, always the center, always moving. Still was the one thing she had never been. Still was the one thing her entire life was organized to prevent. Because stillness meant silence, and silence meant emptiness, and emptiness meant facing the question that she had successfully avoided for a decade by filling every moment with sound. But now the sound was gone, taken, removed by a pair of nodules and a surgeon's laser, and the sovereign hand of a God who had watched his daughter run on a treadmill of performance for 10 years and had finally, lovingly, mercifully, pulled the plug. And in the stillness that followed, in the silence that she had not chosen, but could not escape, Bethany Grace heard something that she had never heard before. Not an audible voice, not words spoken into the air. Something deeper, something that entered through a door she had not known existed. A door that had been hidden behind the noise and the music and the applause for so long that she had forgotten it was there. It was a knowing, a wordless communication that bypassed her ears and her intellect and landed directly in the center of her chest, in the place where her deepest self lived. The self that existed before the voice and the career and the persona. And the knowing said this, Bethany, I don't need your voice. I want your heart. She set the Bible on her lap and pressed her hands against her chest and wept, silently because she had no other option, but deeply, the way a person weeps when the tears come not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finally hearing the truth after years of listening to lies. God did not need her voice. God had never needed her voice. The 50,000 people were not worshiping because of Bethany Grace. They were worshiping because God was God, and He would be God with or without a spotlight and a microphone and an angel voice hitting a high B flat. He wanted her, not the worship leader, not the Grammy nominee, not the woman with 4.2 million followers. Her, the girl from Lexington, Kentucky, who had first sung in a tiny Baptist church where the pews creaked, and the piano was out of tune. And the congregation was 37 people who sang off-key, but sang with their whole hearts. That girl had worshiped. That girl had sung not for an audience, but for an audience of one. That girl had not cared about range or pitch or production value. She had cared about Jesus. And somewhere in the 10 years between that tiny church and the 50,000-seat auditorium, that girl had gotten lost, buried under layers of success and recognition and the intoxicating, addictive, spiritually deadly drug of public ministry. Bethany sat on the edge of her bed for a long time. The morning light moved across the room. Grace the cat jumped onto the bed and curled up beside her. The house was quiet. David was at the studio. The phone was off. The world was continuing without her. And for the first time, that fact did not terrify her. It freed her, because if the world could continue without her voice, then her voice was not what made her valuable. Something else made her valuable, something that could not be taken away by nodules or surgery or the passage of time, something that had been waiting patiently, silently, for her to stop singing long enough to hear it. She opened the Bible to Psalm 46:10 again. She read the verse one more time, and then she did something she had never done in 10 years of professional worship ministry. She closed her mouth, folded her hands, bowed her head, and worshiped God in silence. No melody, no lyrics, no chord progression, no audience. Just a woman and her God, sitting together in a quiet room on a February morning with nothing between them but honesty and love. And it was, without question, the most genuine act of worship Bethany Grace had ever offered. Because for the first time, the worship was not about what she could give. It was about who He already was. The shift did not happen overnight. It happened the way all real spiritual growth happens, slowly, unevenly, with setbacks and breakthroughs and long stretches of ordinary days that look like nothing from the outside, but feel like everything from the inside. Bethany called it learning to listen, and the phrase was more literal than most people understood. She was learning, for the first time in her adult life, to exist in silence and discover that the silence was not empty. It was full, fuller than any auditorium she had ever played, fuller than any chorus she had ever led, full of a presence that had been there all along, waiting behind the wall of noise she had built, patient and quiet and inexhaustible. She started with mornings, every day at 6 before David woke up, before the day's demands began their slow accumulation. Bethany would sit in the armchair by the living room window with her Bible and a cup of tea and do nothing. She did not sing. She did not speak. She did not play music or listen to podcasts or check her phone. She sat in the silence and let it surround her the way water surrounds a swimmer. And she waited for the knowing that had come to her on that February morning to come again. And it did, not always with words. Not always with specific direction. Sometimes it was just a warmth, a sense of being held, the feeling that someone was sitting across from her in the empty room, not saying anything, just being present, just being there. She began reading the Bible the way she had never read it before. Not as a songwriter looking for material, not as a worship leader preparing a sermon illustration, as a person who was hungry. She started with the Psalms, because the Psalms were written by worshipers, and she needed to understand what worship looked like when it was stripped of performance. She found David, the original David, the shepherd king, writing prayers that were messy and honest and sometimes angry and sometimes ecstatic and always, always personal. She found psalms of lament that sounded like her own grief. She found psalms of praise that had nothing to do with music and everything to do with gratitude. She found Psalm 51, written after David's worst failure, after his sin with Bathsheba, after the prophet Nathan confronted him. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. A broken and contrite heart, not a beautiful voice, not a sold-out arena, not a Grammy nomination. A broken heart. That was what God wanted. That was the offering he valued above all others. And Bethany, sitting in her armchair with her broken voice and her broken pride and her Bible open on her lap, realized that she had the most valuable thing she could offer God, and she had been trying to give him something else entirely. She began to take walks, long, slow, aimless walks through the neighborhoods of Brentwood and into the parks and greenways that threaded through the Nashville suburbs. She walked without earbuds, without music, without the soundtrack that had accompanied every moment of her life for a decade. She listened to the wind. She listened to the birds. She listened to the crunch of gravel under her feet and the distant sound of traffic and the way the trees sounded different in winter than in summer, bare branches, clicking together like bones instead of the lush rustle of leaves. She listened to the world, and the world, it turned out, was not silent at all. It was an orchestra that she had never heard because she had been too busy singing over it. She began to listen to people. This was perhaps the most profound change, and the one that surprised her most. Bethany had spent 10 years being listened to, on stage, in interviews, in meetings, in conversations that revolved around her music, her ministry, her voice. She was accustomed to being the speaker, the singer, the one who filled the room with sound. But now, without a voice, she could not fill anything. She could only receive. And so she began to sit with people, friends, neighbors, church members who visited, and listen to their stories with the full, undivided, voiceless attention of a woman who had nothing to contribute but her presence. She discovered something extraordinary. People opened up to her in ways they never had before, without the pressure of reciprocal conversation, without the expectation of a response, without the noise of two people performing the social ritual of talking at each other. People spoke from a deeper place. They told her things they had never told anyone. Fears, doubts, griefs, confessions that had been locked inside them for years, poured out into the safe, silent space that Bethany's voicelessness created. She would sit across from a woman at a coffee shop, whiteboard in her lap, and the woman would talk for an hour about her failing marriage or her struggling child or her secret addiction. And when she was finished, she would look at Bethany with tears in her eyes and say, "I've never told anyone that before. Thank you for listening." David watched this transformation with a quiet, profound joy that he carried like a secret treasure. The woman who came home from these encounters was not the woman who used to come home from the stage. The stage woman was wired, electric, buzzing with the high of performance, and would crash within hours. This woman was calm, peaceful, present in a way that she had not been in years. She looked at David with eyes that saw him, actually saw him, not as the producer, not as the support system, not as the manager of her domestic life, but as her husband, her partner, the man she loved. "You're different," David told her one evening. They were sitting on the back porch, watching the winter sunset paint the sky in shades of purple and gold. I know you can't talk, but I want you to know that whatever is happening inside you, I can see it. And it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Bethany picked up her whiteboard. She wrote 4 words and held them up for David to read. I can finally hear. David looked at the whiteboard. Then he looked at his wife. And he felt, with the certainty of a man whose dangerous prayer had been answered, that the silence that had taken her voice had given her something infinitely more valuable. It had given her ears. Pastor Michael Torres had been the senior pastor of Harvest Life Church for 22 years. He was a large, gentle man with silver hair and a voice that could fill a room without a microphone, though he always used one anyway because the room held 20,000 people. He had built Harvest Life from a storefront church of 200 into one of the largest and most influential congregations in the South. And he had done it not through charisma or marketing, but through the simple, stubborn, old-fashioned practice of loving people and telling the truth. He was also Bethany's spiritual father, the man who had recognized her gift when she was 19 and given her the first worship-leading opportunity that had launched her career. He came to see her in March, 9 months after Christmas Eve, 3 months after her surgery. She was healing well. Dr. Park was pleased with the progress. Her vocal cords were recovering. She had been cleared for light speaking, short conversations in a quiet voice, no singing yet, but the silence was beginning to lift. And Michael Torres sat in her living room and drank coffee and made small talk for 20 minutes before he said the thing he had come to say. Bethany, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it before you answer. The Christmas Eve service is coming again. It's been a year since last time, and I'm not asking you to sing. I know you're not ready for that, and even if you were, I'm not sure that's what this moment calls for. What I'm asking is different. He set down his coffee and leaned forward with the earnest, unhurried manner of a man who has learned that the most important words require the most careful delivery. I want you to share your story on that stage on Christmas Eve. I want you to tell 20,000 people what happened to you this year. Not the medical part, the God part, what he showed you in the silence. Bethany felt her chest tighten. The stage where her voice had died in front of 20,000 people. The stage she had not set foot on in 12 months. The stage that lived in her nightmares as the site of her greatest humiliation. He was asking her to go back there, not as the angel voice, not as the worship leader, as a woman with a broken story and a whiteboard. Michael, I can't sing. My voice is. I know. I'm not asking you to sing. I'm asking you to be honest. Write it on poster boards. Use the screen. Whisper into the microphone. I don't care how you do it. I just know that what God has done in you this year is the most powerful sermon that pulpit has ever needed. And the people who watched you fall apart on that stage last Christmas need to see you stand on it again. Not as a performer, as a witness. Bethany was quiet for a long time. She looked at David, who was sitting in the corner, and David looked back at her with the expression of a man who was not going to make this decision for her, but who was going to support whatever she decided with everything he had. She looked at her hands folded in her lap. She looked at the whiteboard leaning against the couch. She looked at the Bible on the coffee table, the same Bible that had fallen open to Psalm 46:10 9 months ago, and had become, in the intervening time, the most read book in the house. Michael, she said softly, her voice still fragile, still healing. I'm afraid. I know. I'm afraid of being on that stage and having nothing to give. Michael Torres smiled, and in that smile was 22 years of pastoral wisdom. Bethany, having nothing to give is exactly the point. That's the whole sermon. You don't have to bring anything to that stage except the truth. And the truth is that God met you in the silence, and he was enough. If you can stand up there and say that, even without your voice, it will be the most powerful worship this church has ever experienced. She spent 2 weeks preparing, not the old way, rehearsing vocal runs and perfecting musical arrangements. The new way, sitting in her armchair in the silence, asking God what He wanted her to say, writing words on poster boards in large, simple letters, testing them, revising them, praying over them. David helped her design the boards, cutting them to size, choosing a font that was large enough to read from the back of the auditorium. They made 12 boards, 12 simple statements that told the story of the worst and best year of Bethany Grace's life. The night before Christmas Eve, Bethany stood outside Harvest Life Church in the parking lot. The building was dark, the staff having gone home for the evening. She looked up at the structure that had been the center of her world for a decade, the place where she had stood before 50,000 people and led them in worship with the angel voice. And she felt afraid. But beneath the fear, deeper than the fear, more durable than the fear, was something else. The peace she had found in the silence, the knowing that had come to her in February, the unshakable conviction that God did not need her voice. He wanted her heart, and her heart, broken and broken again and healed again, was ready. She whispered into the cold December air, her voice thin but present, a voice that was learning to be small after years of being large. God, tomorrow I'm going back on that stage, not with my voice, with your story. Let it be enough. Let my brokenness be enough. The wind stirred. The parking lot lights hummed. And somewhere in the silence, the knowing came again, warm and sure and gentle. It always was. Christmas Eve at Harvest Life Church. 20,000 seats filled. The same white birch trees and twinkling lights and artificial snow. The same cameras. The same live stream. The same electricity of anticipation that fills a room when 20,000 people gather on the holiest night of the year to celebrate the birth of a king. Everything was the same. Everything was different. The worship set was led by Lauren, the young woman who had taken over when Bethany's voice disappeared. She was good. She was gifted. She led the congregation through 40 minutes of music with passion and skill, and the worship was genuine. And God was present. Bethany sat in the front row beside David and felt none of the jealousy she would have expected. She felt gratitude. Gratitude that the worship continued. Gratitude that God had raised up another voice to lead His people. Gratitude that the ministry was not hers. It was His, and He would never run out of instruments. After the worship set, Pastor Michael took the stage. "Church," he said, "a year ago tonight, something happened on this stage that many of you witnessed. Our beloved Bethany Grace lost her voice in the middle of O Holy Night. Many of you have been praying for her all year. Many of you have wondered what happened. Tonight, Bethany is going to share her story with you. She cannot sing. She can barely speak. But she has something to say that I believe God wants every person in this building to hear. Please welcome Bethany Grace." The applause began immediately. Not the polite, welcoming applause of a typical introduction. The thunderous, emotional, sustained applause of 20,000 people who had been praying for a woman they loved and were watching her walk back onto the stage they had last seen her flee. Bethany walked slowly. She was wearing a simple blue dress. No spotlight. She had asked the production team to keep the house lights up so she could see the faces. She wanted to see them. She needed to see them, not as an audience, as a family. She reached the center of the stage. The applause faded. The room settled. 20,000 people leaned forward in their seats. And Bethany Grace, the woman who had filled this room with sound for a decade, stood before them in silence and held up the first poster board. "1 year ago, I stood on this stage and my voice disappeared." She let the words land. She counted to 5. She set the board down and held up the second. "For months, I was angry at God. I thought He had taken my greatest gift." Third board. "Then I read Psalm 46:10. Be still and know that I am God." Fourth board. "I realized I had never been still. Not once. In 10 years of ministry, I had never stopped singing long enough to listen. Fifth board. In the silence, I heard God for the first time. Not in music, not in applause, in quiet. Sixth board. He said, "Bethany, I don't need your voice. I want your heart." She paused. The room was so quiet that the sound of 20,000 people breathing was audible. People were weeping. Not a few people. Hundreds, thousands. Silent tears running down faces in every section of the auditorium, from the front row to the upper balcony. Because the words on those poster boards were not just Bethany's story. They were the story of every person who had ever confused their gift with their God. Every pastor who measured his worth by his sermon ratings. Every musician who measured his closeness to God by the quality of his performance. Every volunteer who measured her faith by her busyness. Every Christian who had been so consumed by doing things for God that they had forgotten to simply be with God. Seventh board. I learned that worship is not what we do. Eighth board. Worship is who we love. Ninth board. I lost my voice, but I found my God. 10th board. I was the worship leader who couldn't worship. 11th board. Now I am the worshiper who doesn't need a stage. She held up the 12th and final board. She had agonized over this one. She had rewritten it 14 times. She had prayed over it every morning for 2 weeks. And the words that remained, the words that had survived every revision, were the simplest and the truest she had ever written. He is enough. She held it up and let the silence do what the silence does best. She let it create space. Space for the words to sink in. Space for the Holy Spirit to move. Space for 20,000 people to confront the same question she had confronted on her couch 11 months ago. Is God enough? Without the gifts, without the success, without the things we do, and the roles we play, and the identities we construct. Is He, by Himself, with nothing added, enough? The room answered, not with applause, not with amens, not with any sound at all. The room answered by standing. 20,000 people rose to their feet in a wave that started in the front and moved backward through the auditorium, like a ripple in a pond. And they stood in silence, honoring the silence, joining Bethany in the silence, worshiping not with their voices, but with their presence, not with their gifts, but with their surrender. And then, from somewhere in the balcony, a voice began to sing. One voice, soft and unsteady and imperfect, a woman's voice, singing the song that had been interrupted a year ago. "O holy night, the stars are brightly shining." Another voice joined, and another, and another. Slowly, organically, without direction or orchestration or any human planning, the congregation began to sing. Not the worship team, not the choir, the people. 20,000 imperfect voices, some off-key, some cracking with tears, some barely above a whisper, singing "O Holy Night" to the woman who had lost her voice and found her worship, and to the God who had orchestrated it all. Bethany stood on the stage and listened. She did not sing. She could not sing, but she did not need to, because for the first time in her life, she understood what worship really was. It was not the angel voice. It was not the Grammy nomination. It was not the spotlight or the fog machine or the perfectly executed key change in the bridge. Worship was this: 20,000 broken, imperfect, beautiful people lifting their voices to a God who did not need their perfection, who only wanted their hearts, and their hearts were enough. They had always been enough. The call from Dr. Park came on a Tuesday afternoon in April, 4 months after the Christmas Eve testimony, and 16 months after the original collapse. Bethany was sitting in her armchair, Bible on her lap, tea in her hand, watching the spring light move across the living room floor. The silence had become her companion. Not her prison, not her punishment. Her companion, the place where she met God every morning and every evening, and in the spaces between. She had grown to love it the way a gardener loves rain, not for what it is, but for what it grows. Bethany, Dr. Park said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. I've been reviewing your latest scans. The nodules are gone. The hemorrhaging has healed completely. Your vocal cords are clean. And the tissue quality is frankly better than I expected. Better than it's looked in years. He paused. Bethany, you can sing again. She sat in the armchair and held the phone and said nothing. Not because she could not speak. She had been speaking normally for months. She said nothing because the news, which should have been the happiest moment of her life, which would have been the happiest moment of her life 16 months ago, landed differently now. It landed not as the restoration of her identity, but as the return of a tool she was no longer defined by. She was grateful, deeply, profoundly grateful. But the gratitude was calm, settled, mature, not the frantic, desperate relief of a woman getting back the thing she could not live without. The quiet thanksgiving of a woman who had learned to live without it, and had found, in the living without, a life more real and more full than the one she had lived with it. Thank you, Dr. Park, she said. That's wonderful news. She sat in the armchair for a long time after she hung up. She thought about what to do with this second chance. The old Bethany would have called her manager, would have started planning the comeback, would have booked the studio time and the concert dates and the conference appearances, would have returned to the stage in a blaze of spotlights and social media announcements and the triumphant narrative of the angel voice rising from the ashes. The new Bethany picked up her phone and called a nursing home. Shady Oaks Senior Living was 15 minutes from Bethany's house. It was a modest facility, clean and well-maintained, but unremarkable. A single-story building with a parking lot and a garden and a common room that smelled like coffee and disinfectant. It housed 64 residents, most of them over 80, many of them with dementia or limited mobility, all of them in the final chapter of lives that had been, in their time, full and complex and beautiful, and almost all of them were lonely. Their children visited when they could, which was not often enough. Their friends had died or moved or forgotten. They spent their days in a common room watching television and waiting for something to happen. Bethany arrived on a Saturday morning with nothing but her guitar. No microphone, no amplifier, no backing tracks, no production, no spotlight. Just a woman with a guitar and a voice that had been silent for 16 months and had been healed by a God who could have healed it on day one, but had waited until the healing would mean something more than the restoration of a career. She sat in a chair in the common room. 15 residents were present, arranged in a semicircle of wheelchairs and recliners. Some were alert and curious. Some were drowsy. One woman in the back was asleep. A man in the front row was staring at the wall with the fixed, distant expression of someone whose mind had traveled to a place the body could not follow. Bethany strummed a chord. The sound filled the small room with a warmth that was almost physical. She adjusted her fingers on the fretboard. She opened her mouth, and for the first time in 16 months, Bethany Grace sang. The voice that came out was not the same voice that had filled stadiums. It could not have been. 16 months of silence and surgery and healing had changed the instrument. The range was slightly smaller. The power was slightly reduced. The effortless precision that had earned her the nickname Angel Voice was now an effortful precision that required concentration and care. But none of that mattered, because the voice that came out was real, truer than it had ever been, stripped of performance and pretense and the desperate need to impress. It was a voice that had been broken and healed and had nothing left to prove. And that voice, singing Amazing Grace in a nursing home common room to an audience of 15, was the most beautiful sound Bethany had ever produced. The woman in the back woke up. The man staring at the wall turned his head. An elderly woman in a floral housecoat began to cry. Another woman, tiny and frail, with white hair and bright blue eyes, began to mouth the words. By the second verse, 3 residents were singing along. By the third verse, almost all of them were. Cracked, wavering, ancient voices, some of them singing from memory because the words to Amazing Grace are stored in a place that even dementia cannot reach. Lifting together in a room that smelled like coffee and disinfectant and was, in that moment, as holy as any cathedral on earth. Bethany sang for an hour. Hymns, old hymns that these people had grown up with, songs from wooden pews and potluck dinners, and Sunday mornings in small-town churches 50 and 60 and 70 years ago. How great thou art! It is well with my soul. Blessed assurance. She sang them simply, with her guitar, with her healed and humbled voice, with tears on her cheeks and a joy in her chest that made every stadium concert she had ever performed feel like a rehearsal for this moment. When she finished, the tiny woman with the white hair and the bright blue eyes reached out and took Bethany's hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. Her eyes were clear and present and full of something that Bethany recognized, because she had finally learned to see it, the light of a person who has walked with God for a very long time. "Honey," the woman said, "that was the most beautiful singing I've ever heard." Bethany smiled. "Thank you. You know what made it beautiful?" "What?" "You meant it." The old woman squeezed her hand. "I've been in churches my whole life, heard a lot of singing. Most of it is pretty, but pretty and true are different things. What you just sang was true. I could hear it. The Lord could hear it. And that's all that matters." Bethany drove home with the windows down, the spring air filling the car, and she sang. Not for an audience, not for a recording, not for any reason except that her voice had been returned to her, and the sky was blue, and the God who had taken it and given it back was riding in the passenger seat, and she wanted to sing him a song. A small, quiet, imperfect, true song. And it was enough. 2 years have passed since a woman in a white dress stood on a stage on Christmas Eve and reached for a note that did not come. 2 years since the silence began. 2 years since Bethany Grace learned what worship really means. And the lesson changed everything. She still sings. The voice came back, not exactly as it was, but transformed, deeper in some registers, softer in others, more textured, more human, like a piece of pottery that has been broken and repaired with gold. The Japanese art of kintsugi, where the cracks are not hidden but highlighted, and the repaired object is considered more beautiful than the original. That is Bethany's voice now. A kintsugi voice, a voice that carries its history in its timbre, that sounds like a woman who has been through something and come out the other side changed. But the voice is no longer the center. It is no longer the identity. It is no longer the thing that Bethany wakes up grateful for or goes to sleep afraid of losing. It is a tool. A beautiful, God-given, carefully tended tool that she uses the way a carpenter uses a hammer, with skill and respect, and the clear understanding that the hammer is not the house. The house is something else entirely. The house is love. The house is worship. The house is the relationship between a woman and her God that exists whether or not there is a song to fill the silence. Bethany left Harvest Life Church. Not in anger, not in bitterness, in obedience. She felt God calling her away from the megachurch, away from the 50,000-seat auditorium, away from the spotlights and the production team and the live stream that reached 500,000 households. He was calling her to something smaller, something quieter, something that the old Bethany would have considered a demotion, but that the new Bethany recognized as a promotion into a different kingdom, a kingdom where the metrics of success are not followers and album sales, but faithfulness and presence, and the willingness to sing for 15 people in a nursing home with the same devotion you once brought to 15,000. She spends her Sundays now at Grace Fellowship, a small church in a converted warehouse on the east side of Nashville. The congregation is 120 people. The worship team is Bethany on guitar, a retired school teacher on piano, and a college student on bass. There is no fog machine. There are no LED screens. The sound system consists of 3 speakers and a mixing board that David donated from his studio. And the worship in that converted warehouse with its concrete floors and its second-hand pews and its stained glass window that someone salvaged from a demolished church and installed in the back wall. The worship is the most authentic, the most intimate, the most God-saturated worship that Bethany Grace has ever led. She also visits hospitals, nursing homes, hospice centers, prisons, the places where people are too sick, too old, too broken, or too forgotten to come to a church. Bethany goes to them. She brings her guitar and her healed voice, and she sings for audiences of 5, of 10, of 1. She sings for a woman dying of cancer who has not heard a hymn in 20 years. She sings for a man in a wheelchair who cannot remember his own name, but who cries when he hears "How Great Thou Art," because the song is stored in a place that even memory loss cannot reach. She sings for inmates in orange jumpsuits who have not heard a gentle voice in years, and who sit in metal chairs in a concrete room and weep because someone came to them. Someone showed up. Someone sang. Her new album, In the Silence, was released in the spring. It is unlike anything she has ever recorded. No anthem, no stadium worship songs, no soaring choruses designed to move 10,000 people to their feet. It is quiet, intimate, sparse, acoustic guitar, piano. Her voice, unadorned, unprocessed, carrying the texture of everything she has been through. The songs are about silence and surrender, and the discovery that God is loudest when we are quietest. The title track opens with 30 seconds of silence before Bethany whispers, barely audible, "In the silence, I heard you. In the stillness, I found you. In the breaking, you made me whole." The album has not gone platinum. It has not been nominated for a Grammy. It has not generated the numbers that her earlier albums generated. It has done something better. It has reached people, specific people, individual people. A worship leader in Oregon who was burning out and did not know how to stop. A pastor's wife in Georgia who had been performing for so long she had forgotten what authenticity felt like. A teenage girl in Ohio who was being pressured to use her voice for a career she did not want, and who needed someone to tell her that God cared more about her heart than her talent. Letters and emails and messages, not millions of them, but hundreds each one. A life touched, a heart reached, a prison of performance unlocked by the key of one woman's honest story. David is beside her still. Did he? Quiet. The man who prayed the dangerous prayer and watched God answer it, and is still watching the answer unfold. He produces the album. He drives her to the nursing homes. He sets up the sound system at Grace Fellowship every Sunday morning and takes it down every Sunday night. And he sits in the front row and watches his wife lead worship with the same expression he has worn for 2 years. The expression of a man who prayed for a miracle and got one, but not the miracle he expected. "You know what's funny?" Bethany told him one night. They were on the back porch again. The same porch, the same sunset, but a different woman watching it. "I used to pray for God to make my voice bigger, stronger, more powerful, more anointed." She laughed softly. "Now I pray for him to make my heart bigger, because the heart is the instrument that really matters. The voice is just the delivery system." She still sits in the armchair every morning. 6 o'clock, Bible, tea, silence. The silence is no longer the absence of her voice. It is the presence of her God, the place where she goes to remember that she is not defined by what she can do, but by whose she is. The place where the worship leader who lost her voice found her song. And the song, the true song, the one that cannot be taken away by nodules or surgery or the passage of time, is this: God is enough. He was enough before Bethany could sing. He was enough while she couldn't. He is enough now that she can again. He is enough in the stadium and in the nursing home and in the prison and in the silence. He is enough in the spotlight and in the dark. He is always, unfailingly, relentlessly, permanently enough. If you are watching this and you have been performing for God instead of resting in Him, if your identity is wrapped around what you do for Him instead of who you are to Him, if you have been so busy singing that you have forgotten to listen, this is your invitation. Stop. Be still. Set down the microphone. Close the laptop. Step off the stage and just be with Him. Not doing, not producing, not performing, just being. You might be surprised by what you hear in the silence, because the God who spoke the universe into existence does not need your noise. He wants your presence. He wants your honesty. He wants your heart, just as it is, broken and imperfect and completely, beautifully enough. Share this with a worship leader, a musician, a pastor, or anyone who has been serving so hard that they have forgotten to simply be with the one they serve. And if this story changed the way you see worship, comment "Be still" below, because in the stillness, He is there. He has always been there, and He has something to say to you that you cannot hear until you stop singing long enough to listen. Be still and know that He is God.